A nation counts its people. The numbers tell a horror story. So the government burns the numbers and the counters. It sounds like the plot of a dystopian novel. But this is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union in 1937. That January, hundreds of thousands of census takers spread across the largest country on Earth, armed with questionnaires and the confidence that they were documenting the triumph of socialism. They went door to door in Moscow apartments, trudged through Siberian snow to remote villages, and navigated the deserts of Central Asia. They asked standard questions. How old are you? What's your occupation? What's your nationality? Can you read and write? The census workers returned with their forms. The data was tabulated, and the results landed on Joseph Stalin's desk. What happened next still chills historians. Stalin didn't celebrate the numbers. He had the census directors arrested. Within months, the head of the Soviet Statistical Administration, the demographers who designed the questionnaire, and dozens of their colleagues were in prison cells being interrogated by the secret police. The charges were absurd even by Stalinist standards: wrecking, espionage, deliberately sabotaging the census to undercount the Soviet population and undermine socialism. Most were shot. The census itself was declared defective, and its results were locked away, forbidden from publication. Why would a government murder its own statisticians? Because they had counted wrong? No, because they had counted correctly. The 1937 census revealed a demographic catastrophe. According to projections based on pre-revolutionary growth rates and Soviet claims of progress, the USSR should have had a population of around 170 million people. The census counted approximately 162 million. Some estimates put the real figure even lower. Between 15 and 20 million Soviet citizens had simply vanished. They weren't hiding in the taiga or misplaced in bureaucratic paperwork. They were dead. Famine, collectivization, deportations, executions, and the grinding machinery of Stalin's terror had erased them from existence. The census didn't lie, and that's why the people who conducted it had to die. But here's where our story takes a deeper turn into mystery. The 1937 census wasn't Stalin's first attempt to count Soviet citizens. It wasn't even his second. 8 years earlier, in 1929, the Soviet government had planned and launched another comprehensive census. That census never produced results. In fact, for decades, it was as if it had never happened at all. Soviet reference books skipped from the 1926 census directly to 1937, and then to the suspiciously high numbers of the 1939 census that replaced the suppressed 1937 count. The 1929 census became a ghost, mentioned in fragments of documents, hinted at in budget records, but absent from official histories. When Western historians during the Cold War tried to track Soviet demographic data, they noticed the gap, but assumed it was simply a postponement, a bureaucratic delay in a chaotic period. It wasn't until the Soviet archives began opening in the 1990s that researchers discovered something far stranger. The 1929 census had actually begun. Census takers had been trained and deployed. Questionnaires had been distributed. Data had been collected, at least partially. And then, suddenly and mysteriously, the entire operation was shut down and scrubbed from the record. Understanding why requires understanding what a census actually means to a government. A census isn't just a bureaucratic exercise in counting heads. It's a fundamental assertion of state power and legitimacy. When a government conducts a census, it's saying, I control this territory, I know who lives here, and I have the administrative capacity to reach into every household. Census data shapes everything from tax collection to military conscription, from the drawing of electoral districts to the allocation of resources. In multi-ethnic empires like the Russian Empire and its Soviet successor, census data determined which nationalities received autonomous republics, which languages were taught in schools, and which groups were considered potential threats. The simple question of what language someone spoke at home could have enormous political consequences. A census could validate a government's claims of progress, literacy, industrialization, and public health improvements, or it could reveal uncomfortable truths about poverty, disease, and discontent. To understand why a census could vanish, you first need to understand what the Soviet Union was trying to become in the 1920s. Picture a country that had just survived its own apocalypse. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 hadn't just overthrown the Tsar. It had unleashed 7 years of violence that nearly destroyed Russia entirely. The civil war that followed was unlike anything the world had seen. It wasn't a clean fight between two armies. It was a chaotic bloodbath involving Reds, Whites, Greens, anarchists, nationalists, warlords, and foreign interventionists, all tearing at the corpse of the Russian Empire. British troops landed in Arkhangelsk. Japanese forces occupied Vladivostok. American soldiers fought in Siberia. Czech legions controlled the Trans-Siberian Railway. Entire regions broke away, declaring independence. Poland seized territory in the west. The Baltic states escaped Russian control. Finland was gone. And through it all, the population suffered unimaginably. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1914 and 1922, Russia lost somewhere between 15 and 20 million people to war, disease, famine, and emigration. World War I killed millions. The Civil War killed millions more. Typhus epidemics swept through populations weakened by malnutrition. The famine of 1921 and 1922 was so catastrophic that the Soviet government had to accept help from the American Relief Administration and other foreign organizations. There are documented cases of cannibalism from the Volga region. Millions of refugees fled across borders into China, Turkey, Poland, and beyond, creating a Russian diaspora that would never return. Cities emptied as urban workers fled to the countryside searching for food. Industrial production collapsed to perhaps 20% of pre-war levels. The railway system, the circulatory system of this vast empire, barely functioned. Locomotives sat rusting. Bridges were destroyed. Skilled workers were dead or had fled. By 1921, Lenin stood atop a mountain of corpses ruling a country that was barely alive. The Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, but what had they won? A wasteland. And their policies during the war, the period known as war communism, had made things worse. They had requisitioned grain from peasants at gunpoint, paying nothing or paying in worthless currency. They had nationalized everything, abolishing private trade entirely. They had tried to run the economy through central command, and the economy had simply stopped functioning. Workers received payment in kind because money was worthless. People bartered. Crime was rampant. The cities were starving. And in 1921, the sailors at Kronstadt, the very sailors who had been among the most radical supporters of the Bolsheviks, rose in revolt demanding free elections and an end to communist dictatorship. Lenin crushed the rebellion, but he got the message. Something had to change, or the revolution would collapse entirely. What Lenin announced in 1921 stunned everyone. The new economic policy was a strategic retreat from pure communism. Small-scale private enterprise would be permitted. Peasants could sell surplus grain on the open market after paying a tax. Private traders could open shops and make profits. Artisans could employ workers. The state would control the commanding heights of the economy, heavy industry, banking, foreign trade, but everything else was up for grabs. Orthodox Bolsheviks were horrified. They had fought a civil war to destroy capitalism, and now Lenin was bringing it back. But Lenin was nothing if not ruthlessly practical. The revolution meant nothing if the country died, so capitalism would be allowed to revive the economy temporarily, while the Bolsheviks consolidated power and prepared for the next stage. The results were almost miraculous. Within a few years, the Soviet economy clawed its way back from the abyss. Agricultural production recovered to near pre-war levels as peasants, now able to sell their surplus, had an incentive to produce more. Small factories reopened, trade resumed, the cities filled again as jobs returned and food became available. Moscow and Leningrad experienced a bizarre period of relative normalcy. Cafes opened, private shops sold goods, there was even a stock exchange. NEP men, the new class of private traders and small entrepreneurs, made money and flaunted it, wearing fancy clothes and frequenting restaurants. Meanwhile, communist propaganda still covered the walls and the secret police still arrested enemies of the state. It was a strange hybrid, part socialist dictatorship and part market economy, and it was working. In 1927, a group of statisticians and demographers gathered in Moscow with an ambitious plan. They were going to count every single person in the Soviet Union, not estimate, not sample. Count. Every man, woman and child from the Arctic Ocean to the deserts of Turkmenistan, from the Polish border to the Pacific coast. It was an audacious undertaking that would have been challenging for any government. For the Soviet Union, still recovering from catastrophe and ruling over a territory where vast regions had never been properly surveyed, it bordered on the impossible. But the Bolsheviks didn't think in terms of impossible. They thought in terms of planning, organization, and the application of rational, scientific methods to transform society. If they could win a civil war against overwhelming odds, if they could electrify the countryside, if they could launch a cultural revolution to create Soviet man, then surely they could count their own population. The driving force behind the census planning was the Central Statistical Administration, known by its Russian acronym TSSU. This organization was one of the more remarkable institutions of the early Soviet period. Unlike many Soviet bureaucracies that were staffed primarily by loyal communists with limited expertise, TSSU retained a significant number of professionals who had worked under the Tsarist regime. These were serious scholars, many with advanced degrees in mathematics, demography and economics from Russian and European universities. Men like Osinsky, who would later pay with his life for conducting the 1937 census, were brilliant statisticians who genuinely believed in using data to improve society. They had stayed on after the revolution not necessarily because they were communists, though some were, but because they were professionals who wanted to practice their craft, and because the Bolsheviks, for all their ideological rigidity, understood the value of expertise. These statisticians studied census methods from around the world. They examined how the United States conducted its decennial census, how the British managed to count the population of India, how the Germans organized their statistical operations. They borrowed techniques and adapted them to Soviet conditions. The challenge they faced was unique in scale and complexity. The Soviet Union covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. It contained over 100 distinct ethnic groups speaking dozens of mutually unintelligible languages. Literacy rates varied wildly, from relatively high levels in Moscow and Leningrad to near zero in remote Central Asian villages. Many regions had populations that were nomadic, following herds of reindeer or sheep across vast territories with no fixed addresses. Some mountain villages in the Caucasus had barely acknowledged any central government's authority, whether Tsarist or Soviet. Siberia contained exile settlements and labor camps scattered across distances that defied comprehension. The planning committees that formed in 1927 had to address fundamental questions. How do you design a questionnaire that works for a Moscow factory worker and a Kazakh nomad? What languages do you print it in? How do you even transliterate some languages that had no standardized written form? Who would actually conduct the census? The Soviet Union didn't have enough trained statisticians to count even a fraction of the population directly. They would need to mobilize an army of census takers, hundreds of thousands of them, and train them quickly. These census takers would need to be people with at least basic literacy, some understanding of the questionnaire, and the ability to travel to remote areas. The obvious pool was party activists, teachers, and literate young people who could be pressed into service. But even identifying and training this workforce was a massive logistical undertaking. The questionnaire design itself became a fascinating window into Soviet priorities and anxieties. The basic demographic questions were standard: name, age, sex, marital status, place of birth, current residence. But then came the politically loaded questions. What is your nationality? This wasn't asking about citizenship. Everyone in the Soviet Union was Soviet, but about ethnic identity. Were you Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Georgian, Armenian, Kazakh, Uzbek, Tatar, or one of 100 other recognized nationalities? The question mattered enormously because the Soviet federal structure was built on nationality. Autonomous republics, regions, and districts were defined by ethnic composition. Resources, educational policies, and political representation flowed from these designations. An accurate count of nationalities would reveal whether the Soviet promise of national equality was working, or whether some groups were growing while others were declining. In November 1929, while statisticians were finalizing census questionnaires and training materials, Joseph Stalin published an article that would change everything. It was titled "The Year of the Great Turn," and it announced the end of gradualism, the end of compromise, the end of the new economic policy. Stalin declared that the Soviet Union would collectivize agriculture completely and eliminate the kulaks as a class. What this meant in practice was nothing less than a war on the countryside, a war that would kill millions and make counting the population not just difficult, but politically impossible. The timing was catastrophic. Just as the census machinery was preparing to deploy across the Soviet Union, Stalin was about to tear rural society apart. The decision to collectivize wasn't entirely irrational, at least not from Stalin's twisted logic. The Soviet Union was embarking on an insanely ambitious industrialization program, the first 5-year plan. New factories were being built, entire cities were being constructed from nothing. The industrial workforce was exploding as peasants flooded into cities looking for work. All these workers needed to eat, and that meant grain, lots of it. But under the new economic policy, the peasants controlled the grain supply. They could sell it or withhold it. They could demand higher prices. In 1928, there had been a grain crisis when peasants, facing low state-mandated prices, simply refused to sell their surplus. They fed it to livestock or stored it instead. Stalin's response was to send activists into the countryside to requisition grain by force, a preview of what was coming. The crisis convinced him that leaving agriculture in private hands was incompatible with rapid industrialization. But there was more to it than economics. Stalin and the party ideologists saw the countryside as enemy territory. The peasants, especially the more prosperous ones labelled kulaks, represented everything the revolution was supposed to destroy. They were petty capitalists, exploiters who hired labour and accumulated property. They were traditionalists who went to church, followed old customs, and resisted Soviet authority. They were potential counter-revolutionaries who might ally with foreign enemies if war came. The paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded. Many peasants hated the Bolsheviks for the requisitions during the Civil War, for the assault on religion, for the constant interference from party activists who knew nothing about farming. But Stalin's solution was to destroy the peasantry as an independent class and remake rural society entirely. Everyone would be forced into collective farms, kolkhozes, where the state could control production, set quotas, and extract grain at will. The definition of kulak was deliberately vague and flexible. Officially, a kulak was a wealthy peasant who exploited hired labour. In practice, the term became a weapon. A kulak might be someone who owned 2 cows instead of 1, someone who had a slightly larger house, someone who hired a neighbour's son to help with harvest, or simply someone who opposed collectivization. Party activists arriving in villages had quotas to fill. Each district was told it had to identify a certain percentage of kulaks, usually around 5% of households. If the actual number of wealthy peasants was lower, which it often was, then the definition expanded. Middle peasants became kulaks. Poor peasants who complained became kulak sympathizers. The accusations were often driven by local grudges, jealousies, and score settling. Neighbour denounced neighbour. The village drunk pointed at the village's most successful farmer. Chaos and terror spread. The dekulakization campaign began in earnest in late 1929 and early 1930. It was systematic and brutal. Kulak families were divided into 3 categories. The first category, the most dangerous, would be shot or sent to labour camps. The second category would be deported to remote regions, Siberia, Kazakhstan, the far north. The third category would be expelled from their villages, but allowed to remain in the general area, usually on marginal land. In practice, the distinctions were often meaningless. Armed detachments of party activists, workers from cities, and NKVD officers swept through villages. They identified kulak households based on lists prepared by local officials. Then they came in the night or early morning. Families were given hours, sometimes minutes, to gather belongings. Everything else was confiscated. The house, the livestock, the tools, the grain, even clothing and furniture. So, did the 1929 census actually happen? For decades, the answer seemed to be no. Soviet reference books jumped from the 1926 census directly to 1937, then to 1939, with no mention of 1929. Western demographers assumed it had simply been postponed, but when Soviet archives began opening in the 1990s, historians started finding fragments. A budget allocation here, a training manual there, regional reports mentioning census operations, partial returns from some districts. The picture that emerged was strange and fragmentary, like trying to reconstruct a building from scattered bricks. The census had been launched, at least partially. Census takers had been deployed to at least some regions. Data had been collected, though how much and how complete remains unclear. And then, suddenly and mysteriously, the entire operation had been shut down. The records were scattered, suppressed, or destroyed. What survives are glimpses, fragments that hint at a larger catastrophe. The most detailed accounts come from regional archives, particularly from areas that were less affected by the initial waves of collectivization. In some districts of central Russia, census takers did go out in late 1929. They followed their training, carrying questionnaires and attempting to count households. Their reports, where they survive, paint a picture of an operation struggling against impossible odds. One census taker in a rural district outside Moscow reported that nearly a third of the households on his list no longer existed. The families had either been deported as kulaks or had fled to the city. When he asked local officials where these people had gone, he received evasive answers or outright hostility. How was he supposed to count people who had disappeared? Should he mark them as absent, as deported? The categories on his forms didn't cover the reality he was encountering. Another report, this one from Ukraine, described peasant resistance. The census taker arrived in a village recently collectivized. The peasants had been forced into a kolkhoz just weeks earlier. Their livestock had been confiscated. Several families had been deported. The remaining villagers viewed any official with deep suspicion and hostility. When the census taker began asking questions about household composition, occupation, and class background, people refused to answer or gave obviously false information. One peasant claimed to have no occupation when he was clearly a farmer. Another refused to state his nationality. The census taker noted in his report that the atmosphere was threatening and that he feared for his safety. He completed only a fraction of the households he was supposed to count before leaving the village. His supervisor, reading the report back at the district office, faced a dilemma. Should he report accurate numbers that were embarrassingly low, or should he inflate the figures to meet expectations? This was the pattern repeating across the countryside. Census takers encountered villages in chaos. Administrative records were unreliable or non-existent. Local officials were overwhelmed with collectivization and grain requisitions and had no time or interest in facilitating a census. The peasants themselves were either gone, uncooperative, or deliberately misleading. And the data that was collected revealed uncomfortable truths. Population numbers were lower than expected. Many households couldn't be accounted for. The literacy rates that were supposed to be rising impressively were disappointing. The class composition didn't match official narratives. Middle peasants who should have been enthusiastically supporting collectivization were clearly hostile. The evidence of resistance, deportation, and demographic disruption was everywhere. In the cities, the situation was different but equally chaotic. Urban populations were exploding as peasants fled the countryside. Moscow, Leningrad, and industrial centers were experiencing massive influxes of refugees and job seekers. Housing couldn't keep up. People were living in factory barracks, basements, hallways, anywhere they could find space. Multiple families crowded into single rooms. The authorities tried to control internal migration through the passport system and residence permits, but enforcement was impossible. How do you count a population that's constantly moving? A census taker might count a family in a communal apartment on Monday, but by Wednesday they'd moved in with relatives across the city or left for another industrial centre entirely. There's no dramatic memo titled "Cancel the Census." No official decree signed by Stalin ordering the operation terminated. No public announcement explaining why the ambitious project that had consumed years of planning and significant resources was being abandoned. The 1929 census didn't end with a bang. It faded away with a bureaucratic whimper, leaving historians to piece together what happened from hints, implications, and the sudden absence of documentation. The best evidence suggests that sometime between late 1929 and early 1930, someone high up in the Soviet hierarchy decided that continuing the census was politically impossible. The operation was quietly shut down, and then an even more remarkable thing happened. The Soviet state began systematically erasing evidence that the census had ever been attempted. The fragmentary records that survive suggest the end came in stages. Regional statistical offices received vague instructions about postponing census operations due to technical difficulties or resource constraints. Census takers were told to halt fieldwork and return materials to district offices. Local officials, already overwhelmed with collectivization and probably relieved to have one less burden, complied without asking questions. The official explanations varied depending on who was asking. In some regions, officials cited bad weather making rural travel impossible. In others, they mentioned the need to focus all resources on collectivization and grain collection. Some simply said the census had been rescheduled for a later date without specifying when. The explanations were deliberately vague and inconsistent, which is often a sign that the real reason can't be stated openly. What was really happening behind closed doors in Moscow? We can't know for certain because the Politburo discussions from this period, if minutes were even kept, remain classified or were destroyed. But we can make educated guesses based on what we know about how Stalin's regime functioned and what the census was revealing. Imagine you're a Politburo member in early 1930. Reports are coming in from the countryside describing catastrophic resistance to collectivization. Peasants are slaughtering livestock by the millions. Grain production is falling, not rising. Deportations have removed hundreds of thousands of families from their villages. Other peasants are fleeing to cities or simply disappearing. The NKVD is reporting local uprisings and violence, and now census reports start arriving showing that rural populations are significantly lower than expected, that villages are empty, that the demographic picture contradicts every official claim about socialist progress. Stalin's response to bad news was predictable and terrifying. He didn't accept that policies might be failing. He blamed saboteurs, wreckers, class enemies, and hidden counter-revolutionaries. Officials who reported problems were accused of being defeatist or worse. In this atmosphere, presenting census data that revealed demographic catastrophe wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially fatal. The statisticians at TSSU understood this perfectly. They had designed a census to validate Soviet achievements, to produce data showing rising literacy, improving health, successful nationality policies, and voluntary enthusiasm for collectivization. Instead, they were getting data showing chaos, resistance, population decline, and massive coercion. Publishing this data was unthinkable, but not publishing it raised equally difficult questions. Someone, probably someone at TSSU in consultation with higher party officials, recognized that the census had become a political disaster in the making. The partial data that existed couldn't be published because it contradicted official narratives. But it also couldn't simply be ignored because too many people knew about the census operations. The solution, characteristically Soviet in its audacity, was to make the census disappear retroactively. Not just cancel it, but erase it from history, as if the entire effort had never happened. This required controlling documentation, controlling the narrative, and probably controlling or silencing the people who knew too much. If the 1929 census had revealed early warning signs of demographic disaster, what came next was the catastrophe itself. Between 1930 and 1933, the Soviet Union experienced a famine so severe, so widespread, and so clearly man-made that it ranks among the greatest crimes of the 20th century. Millions of people starved to death while grain sat in government warehouses and was exported abroad. The famine wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't caused by drought or crop failure. It was the direct result of Stalin's collectivization policies, a catastrophe that could have been prevented, but instead was deliberately allowed to unfold and, in some regions, actively engineered as a weapon against populations deemed unreliable or resistant. Understanding this famine is crucial to understanding why the 1929 census had to disappear and why the 1937 census would reveal numbers so shocking that its directors would be shot. The mechanism of the famine was brutally simple. Collectivization had destroyed the productive capacity of Soviet agriculture. The slaughter of livestock, The deportation of the most productive farmers, the disruption of planting and harvesting, and the chaos of reorganizing millions of individual farms into collective farms had all combined to reduce agricultural output. But Stalin's regime needed grain, both to feed industrial workers in the cities and to export for hard currency to buy foreign machinery for industrialization. The solution was to extract grain from the countryside, regardless of whether enough remained for the peasants to survive. Grain requisition quotas were set impossibly high. Collective farms had to deliver a set amount of grain to the state before peasants could keep anything for themselves. In many regions, the quotas exceeded total production, meaning everything was taken. The devastation hit different regions with varying intensity, but nowhere suffered more than Ukraine. The Ukrainian famine of 1932 and 1933, known as the Holodomor, killed somewhere between 3 and 5 million people. The exact number will never be known because the Soviet government suppressed demographic data and because entire villages died with no one left to count the bodies. Ukraine had been one of the most productive agricultural regions of the Russian Empire, the breadbasket that fed much of Eastern Europe. It also had a strong national identity and a history of resistance to Russian and Soviet control. Stalin saw Ukrainian nationalism as a threat. The famine became an opportunity to break Ukrainian resistance once and for all. Grain requisitions in Ukraine were particularly brutal. Special brigades searched peasant homes for hidden grain, tearing up floors and breaking into walls. Peasants caught with even small amounts of grain were accused of theft of socialist property and shot or sent to labor camps. By the spring of 1932, starvation had begun. By the fall, it was widespread. By the winter of 1932 and 1933, it was apocalyptic. People died in their homes, in the streets, in the fields. The death toll was so high that bodies lay unburied because there was no one with the strength to bury them. Children with distended bellies from starvation wandered roads looking for food. There are documented cases of cannibalism, desperate acts by people driven mad by hunger. Parents ate their own children. Villages became ghost towns, with every inhabitant dead. Soviet authorities blocked peasants from leaving famine regions. Internal passports and travel restrictions prevented refugees from fleeing to cities where there was food. Checkpoints were set up on roads and railways to turn back the starving. Those who tried to escape were arrested or shot. The message was clear: you will meet your grain quota or you will die. Kazakhstan suffered a proportionally even worse catastrophe. The Kazakh population was largely nomadic, herding livestock across vast steppes. Collectivization meant forcing nomads to settle and join collective farms, completely destroying their way of life. The Kazakhs resisted, and the Soviet response was genocidal. Between 1930 and 1933, approximately 40% of the Kazakh population died, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people. It was demographic collapse on a scale that nearly destroyed an entire nation. The North Caucasus and the Volga region also experienced severe famine. In these grain-producing areas, peasants starved while their grain was requisitioned and shipped to cities or exported. Soviet officials in Moscow knew exactly what was happening. Reports came in from regional officials describing mass starvation. But Stalin's response was to accuse those who reported the famine of spreading panic and anti-Soviet propaganda. By 1936, Stalin decided it was time to prove to the world that socialism worked. The famine was over. Collectivization was complete. The first 5-year plan had been declared a success. The Soviet Union was supposedly transformed. A modern industrial power with rising living standards and a happy, literate population. A new census would document this triumph and provide the statistical proof that would silence critics both domestic and foreign. Stalin personally ordered the census, expecting it to validate everything the Soviet propaganda machine had been claiming. The census directors, understanding exactly what was expected of them, designed questionnaires and organized operations with the goal of producing politically acceptable results. But numbers, unlike people, can't be terrorized into compliance. What the 1937 census revealed was so catastrophic that it sealed the fate of everyone involved in conducting it. The preparations began in 1936 with the formation of a new census commission. Leading it were some of the Soviet Union's most distinguished statisticians, including men who had survived the purges through a combination of competence and political caution. They knew the stakes. This census had to show population growth, rising literacy, successful nationality policies, and general prosperity. The questionnaire was carefully designed with these goals in mind. Some questions were worded to encourage politically correct answers. The question about religion was included despite the Soviet Union being officially atheist, because Stalin wanted to prove that religious belief was declining. The nationality question was designed to show that Soviet peoples were integrating harmoniously. Every aspect of the census was meant to produce data that could be used for propaganda purposes. The census date was set for January the 6th, 1937, in the middle of winter, when populations would be relatively settled and easy to count. The mobilization was massive. According to some estimates, over 800,000 census takers were trained and deployed across the Soviet Union. They went everywhere, into apartments in Moscow and Leningrad, into collective farms in Ukraine, into remote villages in Siberia, into the labor camps of the Gulag, into hospitals and orphanages and barracks. The operation was thorough and comprehensive. Within a few weeks, they had counted virtually everyone in Soviet territory. The questionnaires were collected, sent to regional centers for preliminary tabulation, and then forwarded to Moscow, where the Central Statistical Administration would compile the final numbers. The preliminary results began arriving in late January and February, and immediately there was a problem. The population numbers were far too low. According to official projections based on pre-revolutionary growth rates and Soviet claims of improving health and living standards, the Soviet Union should have had a population of somewhere between 170 and 180 million people. The census was counting barely 160 million. The gap was enormous, somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. Where had they gone? The statisticians knew exactly where they had gone. They had died in the famine, been shot in the purges, perished in the labor camps, or never been born because birth rates had collapsed. But acknowledging this truth was impossible. The census directors faced an impossible dilemma. They could report the accurate numbers and face Stalin's wrath, knowing that he would never accept data showing demographic catastrophe. Or they could falsify the results, inflating the population numbers to meet expectations. But large-scale falsification of a comprehensive census was technically difficult and politically dangerous. Too many people had participated in the census for a massive fraud to remain secret. Other statisticians would notice the discrepancies. International demographers would question the numbers. The directors tried to find middle ground, presenting the data with extensive explanations and caveats. They argued that the numbers might be slightly undercounted, that some remote regions might have been missed, that technical problems might have affected accuracy. They were trying to soften the blow, to give Stalin room to interpret the results charitably. In the Soviet Union under Stalin, telling the truth could get you killed, and nothing proved this more dramatically than what happened to the men who conducted the 1937 census. These weren't political dissidents or underground revolutionaries. They were statisticians, demographers, and bureaucrats who had dedicated their careers to collecting accurate data. Some were committed communists who believed in the Soviet project. Others were apolitical professionals who simply wanted to practice their craft. What united them was a fatal mistake. They counted honestly, and for that, they would pay with their lives. The destruction of the census directors wasn't just murder. It was a message to everyone in the Soviet system that loyalty to truth was treason, and that no expertise or professional integrity could protect you if your work contradicted the party line. Valerian Osinsky was perhaps the most tragic figure among them. Born Valerian Obolensky into an aristocratic family, he had become a Bolshevik revolutionary as a young man, rejecting his privileged background to fight for socialism. He had been involved in underground revolutionary activity before 1917, had held important positions after the revolution, and had served the Soviet state loyally for 2 decades. He was a genuine intellectual, an economist and statistician who believed that scientific planning could create a better society. In 1936, when he was appointed to oversee the census, he approached the task with the seriousness it deserved. He assembled a team of qualified professionals. He designed methodology that followed international statistical standards. He believed that accurate data would help the Soviet Union improve its policies. He was naive enough to think that Stalin wanted truth. When the census results came, in showing a population far below expectations, Osinski tried to present them honestly, while softening the political implications. He prepared reports with caveats and explanations. He suggested that some undercounting might have occurred in remote regions. He was trying to thread an impossible needle, giving Stalin what he wanted while maintaining some professional integrity. But there was no threading that needle. Stalin didn't want nuance or caveats. He wanted numbers that validated Soviet propaganda, and Osinski had failed to provide them. By spring 1937, it was clear that Osinski was in danger. The terror was intensifying across the Soviet Union. Old Bolsheviks who had made the revolution were being arrested and executed. If Lenin's closest comrades weren't safe, a statistician certainly wasn't. Osinski was arrested on July 21, 1937. The NKVD came for him in the night, the standard procedure. They searched his apartment, confiscated documents and papers, and took him to Lubyanka prison, the headquarters of the secret police in central Moscow. There, in the cellars beneath that infamous building, he faced interrogation. We know from later investigations that NKVD interrogators routinely used torture to extract confessions. Sleep deprivation, beatings, threats to family members, psychological torture. The specific methods used on Osinski aren't fully documented, but we know he eventually confessed to crimes he didn't commit. The confession followed a script that the NKVD had prepared. He admitted to being part of a right-wing conspiracy against the Soviet state. He confessed to deliberately sabotaging the census by instructing census takers to undercount the population. He claimed to be working for foreign intelligence services, providing them with information to undermine the Soviet Union. The charges were absurd on their face. How exactly would undercounting the population help foreign powers? The accusation required believing that Osinski had spent 20 years loyally serving the Soviet state while secretly working to destroy it, and that his chosen method of sabotage was producing accurate census data. But logic didn't matter in Stalin's terror. The confessions weren't meant to be believable. They were meant to demonstrate the power of the state to force anyone, even the most loyal communists, to confess to anything. The confessions validated the terror itself, proving that enemies really were everywhere, even among those who seemed most trustworthy. If an old Bolshevik like Osinski could be an enemy agent, then anyone could be, which meant everyone needed to be watched, suspected, and potentially purged. Now we return to where we started, to the deeper mystery beneath the tragedy of 1937. Why was the 1929 census really cancelled? For decades, this question couldn't even be asked. The census had been so thoroughly erased that most people didn't know it had existed. But when Soviet archives began opening in the 1990s and historians started finding those scattered fragments, the puzzle became irresistible. Here was a major bureaucratic undertaking, carefully planned, partially executed, and then made to vanish so completely that it disappeared from official records for 60 years. What could the census have revealed that was so dangerous it had to be erased before it was even completed? The answer lies not in what the census found, but in what it would have found if it had continued, and in the political context of late 1929, when the decision to cancel was made. Theory 1 focuses on timing and early warning signs. The census operations began just as collectivization was getting underway. The first waves of dekulakization were hitting villages in late 1929 and early 1930. The deportations had started. Peasants were resisting. Livestock were being slaughtered. Villages were being torn apart. The census takers arriving in rural areas were encountering chaos, but more importantly, they were beginning to document it. The partial returns that survived show villages with populations already declining. Reports mention households that couldn't be found, families that had been deported or had fled. The data was starting to reveal that collectivization wasn't the triumphant transformation that propaganda claimed. It was violent, disruptive, and causing immediate demographic damage. Even before the famine, even before the worst of the terror, the census was catching an early snapshot of catastrophe. If the census had continued and been completed, it would have established a baseline population count for 1929 or 1930. That baseline would have been devastating when compared to future counts. The famine that began in 1930 and peaked in 1932 and 1933 killed millions. If there had been an accurate census count from 1929, the losses would have been undeniable and quantifiable. You could compare 1929 to 1933 and see exactly how many people had disappeared. The Soviet government would have official statistical documentation of genocide. Even if they suppressed the later census, the existence of the 1929 baseline would make it impossible to hide the demographic collapse. By cancelling the 1929 census, the regime avoided creating that baseline. When the 1937 census showed catastrophically low population numbers, Stalin could claim it was sabotage, that the real population was higher. Without the 1929 census, there was no recent comparison point to prove otherwise. Theory 2 centres on the nationality question, which was always sensitive in the Soviet Union's multi-ethnic empire. The census questionnaire asked people to identify their nationality, their native language, and the language they commonly used. These questions were designed to show that Soviet nationality policy was succeeding, that different ethnic groups were living harmoniously while maintaining their distinct identities. But what if the data showed something else? What if Ukrainians were identifying as Russian to avoid discrimination? What if Central Asian peoples were rejecting Soviet nationality categories entirely? What if the numbers revealed that certain nationalities were concentrated in regions where they weren't supposed to be, or were declining in their traditional homelands? The nationality data could have been explosively sensitive, especially in Ukraine, where Stalin was already worried about nationalism and separatist tendencies. Some historians have speculated that the census might have revealed inconvenient truths about ethnic composition that contradicted official policies. For instance, if the census showed that Ukrainians were a smaller percentage of Ukraine's population than claimed, it would undermine the legitimacy of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. If it showed that Russians were becoming a minority in certain autonomous regions designated for other nationalities, it would create political problems. The Soviet federal structure was built on ethnic categories and population ratios. Census data that challenged those ratios could force politically difficult adjustments or reveal that the whole system was built on false foundations. After shooting the census directors, Stalin still had a problem. He needed population numbers that proved Soviet success. He needed statistics that could be published internationally, cited in propaganda, and used to plan the economy. The suppressed 1937 census had created a vacuum. Foreign observers were asking questions. Soviet planners needed demographic data, even if it was fake. The solution was to conduct another census, but this time with the outcome predetermined. The 1939 census would give Stalin the numbers he wanted. Accuracy be damned. And for the next 50 years, the Soviet regime would maintain an elaborate system of secrecy, falsification, and suppression around population data, creating a statistical fog so thick that Western demographers could only guess at the truth hidden beneath the lies. Planning for the 1939 census began almost immediately after the 1937 census was suppressed. But this time, everything was different. The statisticians who had survived the purge understood exactly what was expected of them. There would be no professional integrity, no commitment to accuracy, no naive belief that honest data would be valued. Their job was to produce numbers that matched political requirements. The new directors of the census were chosen not for their statistical expertise, but for their political reliability. They were party loyalists who understood that survival meant giving Stalin what he wanted. The methodology was adjusted with this goal in mind. Census takers received instructions that emphasized complete coverage, with strong suggestions that undercounting would be considered sabotage. The census was conducted in January 1939 using similar methodology to 1937, but with crucial differences in execution and tabulation. Census takers were supervised more closely by party officials. There were reports, impossible to verify but persistent, that census workers were instructed to count some populations twice, or to estimate numbers for regions where actual counting proved difficult. The Gulag population, which officially didn't exist for statistical purposes, may have been included or excluded depending on what produced higher totals. Regions with known population losses were handled creatively. The final tabulation was conducted under tight political control, with party officials reviewing the numbers at every stage. When the results were announced, the Soviet Union's population was reported as 170 million, a convenient and impressive number that showed substantial growth since 1926. The number was almost certainly inflated by at least 10 million people, possibly more. But it was politically acceptable. Stalin could claim that the Soviet population was growing, that socialism was improving living standards, that the terrible costs of collectivization and the purges were either exaggerated by enemies or had been more than offset by improvements elsewhere. The 1939 census became the official record, cited in Soviet publications for decades. The fact that it was built on falsification and political manipulation was something everyone involved understood, but nobody could say. The archives containing the 1929 and 1937 census data were sealed under the highest security classification. Access was restricted to a handful of top officials and trusted statisticians who needed the information for internal planning purposes. The files were moved to special storage facilities, where even senior researchers couldn't reach them without explicit permission from the highest levels. Guards protected the physical documents. Strict protocols governed who could view them, under what circumstances, and what they could do with the information. Soviet archival practice created multiple layers of secrecy, with the most sensitive documents hidden within classified collections that were themselves hidden within restricted archives. The census data was buried so deep that most Soviet citizens had no idea it existed. But sealing archives wasn't enough. The people who knew about the suppressed censuses, who had participated in them or had seen the data, had to be silenced. The purge of statisticians continued sporadically through the late 1930s and into the 1940s. Anyone who had been too closely associated with the 1937 census and had somehow survived the initial purge might find themselves arrested years later on some pretext. The culture of fear that Stalin cultivated meant that survivors didn't talk about what they knew. Discussing suppressed census data with colleagues could get you accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. Mentioning the discrepancies to family members could result in their arrest too. The knowledge became toxic, something to be forgotten if possible, buried in memory if not. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The red flag came down from the Kremlin. The Communist Party lost its monopoly on power, and slowly, hesitantly, the archives began to open. For historians, it was like finally getting access to a crime scene that had been sealed for 60 years. They knew terrible things had happened, they had suspected the outlines of the truth. But now, for the first time, they could see the actual evidence. Russian historians and Western researchers descended on the state archives in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and regional centers across the former Soviet Union. What they found was both revelatory and frustrating. Some secrets were finally exposed. Others remained tantalizingly out of reach, hidden or destroyed, leaving gaps that would probably never be filled. The first major breakthrough came when researchers gained access to the Central State Archive of the Russian Federation and the Russian State Archive of the Economy. These repositories contained the working files of Soviet government ministries and statistical agencies. Buried in these files were documents that mentioned the 1929 census, proving definitively that it had actually been planned and partially executed. Budget allocations showed significant expenditures for census operations in 1929 and early 1930. Correspondence between regional statistical offices and Moscow discussed census preparations, census taker training, and problems with implementation. Internal memos from the Central Statistical Administration referenced preliminary data and logistical difficulties. For historians who had long suspected the census existed, this was vindication. The Soviet government really had tried to erase an entire census from history. Even more dramatic was the opening of files related to the 1937 census. Historians found the actual suppressed results, the numbers that had gotten the census directors killed. The total population count was there, along with breakdowns by region, nationality, age, and gender. The demographic catastrophe was laid bare in columns of numbers. Researchers could see exactly how far below expectations the population had fallen. They could identify which regions had been most affected. They could track the missing cohorts, the ages and demographics that should have existed but didn't. The data confirmed what Western demographers had long suspected. The Soviet Union had experienced massive population losses in the early 1930s, and the regime had spent decades hiding the evidence. But the 1929 census data remained elusive. Researchers found references to it, fragments of it, evidence that it had existed. But the central tabulation, if it had ever been compiled, was missing. Regional archives contained the most revealing materials. In Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and various Russian provinces, historians discovered partial census returns from late 1929 and early 1930. These were often incomplete, covering only certain districts or population categories. Some were damaged, with pages missing or text faded beyond legibility. Others had clearly been deliberately mutilated, with sections torn out or redacted. What survived showed villages with declining populations, households that couldn't be located, and census taker reports describing chaos and non-cooperation. One particularly valuable find was a set of training materials from a regional statistical office in central Russia. These documents explained to census takers how to fill out questionnaires, how to handle difficult situations, and how to record data accurately. The materials were dated to 1929 and explicitly referred to the upcoming census. More importantly, they included sample questionnaires and methodology guidelines that showed what information the census was designed to collect. Researchers could see exactly what questions were being asked and understand what the regime had hoped to learn. The discovery of these training materials helped historians reconstruct the census methodology even without the final data. How do you count ghosts? How do you reconstruct a census that was deliberately destroyed? For demographers and historians working in the post-Soviet era, this became an obsessive puzzle. They had fragments, hints, and circumstantial evidence. They had the 1926 census, which was relatively reliable. They had the suppressed 1937 census results. Between those 2 points lay a demographic black hole, a period when millions of people vanished and no comprehensive record was kept. But modern demographic science has powerful tools. By combining multiple sources, applying sophisticated statistical methods, and doing painstaking detective work across scattered archives, researchers have managed to reconstruct much of what the 1929 census would have shown. The picture that emerges is one of catastrophe, beginning even before the famine, a demographic collapse that started the moment Stalin launched collectivization. The foundation of this reconstruction work is something called the demographic balance method. It's relatively simple in concept, but complex in execution. You start with a known population at one point in time, the 1926 census, which counted approximately 147 million people in the Soviet Union. Then you add births and subtract deaths for each subsequent year, tracking the population forward. If you know how many people were born each year and how many died, you can calculate what the population should be at any future point. The 1937 census then serves as a check on your calculations. If your reconstruction produces a 1937 population close to what the census actually found, you're probably on the right track. The problem, of course, is that Soviet birth and death records from the 1930s were incomplete, falsified, and in some cases destroyed. This is where the detective work begins. Researchers scoured regional archives looking for birth and death registrations that survived. In some provinces, particularly those less affected by the famine, fairly complete records existed. Hospitals, churches before they were closed, and local civil authorities had kept registries. These records could be used to establish baseline birth and death rates for different regions and different years. The data was uneven. Some regions had excellent records, others had huge gaps. But by combining data from multiple regions and using statistical techniques to fill in missing information, demographers could estimate national trends. NKVD documents provided another crucial source, though a grim one. The secret police kept meticulous records of their activities. Archives contained documentation of arrests, deportations, and executions. Researchers found transport manifests showing how many people were deported to Kazakhstan or Siberia, and when. They found execution lists from the Great Terror showing who was shot and when. they found Gulag administration records tracking prisoner populations. These documents allowed historians to account for people who were removed from the general population and either died in camps or were in exile. The NKVD numbers had their own problems. They were sometimes inflated to show zealousness or deflated to hide problems, but they provided a framework for understanding non-natural population losses. Regional statistical offices, particularly in areas that weren't heavily purged or were simply disorganized, sometimes kept data that Moscow ordered destroyed. A researcher working in a provincial archive in the late 1990s might find a file that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, containing population counts from 1929 or 1930 that had escaped destruction through bureaucratic incompetence or deliberate resistance by a local official. These discoveries were random and unpredictable. One archive might have nothing. The next might contain a treasure trove. Systematically searching every regional archive in the former Soviet Union was impossible. The territory is too vast, but researchers tried to hit the most important locations. What emerged from this work was a demographic timeline that showed catastrophe unfolding in stages. In 1929, when the cancelled census would have been conducted, the Soviet population was probably around 152 to 154 million, continuing the growth trend from 1926. But even in 1929, there were warning signs. Birth rates in some rural regions were starting to decline as collectivization disrupted family life. Death rates were beginning to tick upward, particularly in areas experiencing violent decolonization. If the census had been completed honestly, it would have shown these early effects. Villages in Ukraine and Kazakhstan would have shown population declines. Urban populations would have shown massive growth as peasant refugees flooded into cities. The numbers would have revealed a society in upheaval. The legacy of the vanished census extends far beyond a missing statistical document. For decades, the absence of accurate demographic data distorted Soviet planning in ways both tragic and absurd. Economic planners working in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s were making decisions based on population estimates that were fundamentally wrong. They were allocating resources, building infrastructure, and setting production targets for a population that didn't exist. Factory managers were told to produce goods for millions of consumers who had died in the famine. Agricultural planners set grain quotas based on rural populations that had been decimated. The entire planned economy was built on a foundation of lies, and those lies had real consequences. Food shortages, housing crises, labor shortages in some sectors and surpluses in others. And all of these problems were partly caused by planning with false demographic data. But the deeper impact was on memory and truth. Millions of people died in the famine, in the purges, in the deportations. They suffered, they starved, they watched their children die, they were torn from their homes and sent to frozen wastelands, and then they were erased from official history. The census that might have counted them was cancelled. The census that did count the survivors was suppressed. For decades, the Soviet government denied that the famine had even happened. Ukrainian families who had lost entire villages were told they were spreading anti-Soviet lies if they talked about it. Kazakh survivors of genocide were forbidden from mourning their dead publicly. The victims weren't just killed, they were written out of existence, their deaths made officially invisible. This erasure had profound effects on Soviet society. How do you grieve for losses that officially never happened? How do you remember the dead when speaking their names is dangerous? Families developed strategies of silence. Grandparents who had survived the famine would sometimes tell their grandchildren in whispers, making them promise never to repeat the stories. Others simply stopped talking about it, burying the trauma so deep that even they tried to forget. The psychological cost of this enforced amnesia is impossible to calculate. Entire generations grew up knowing something terrible had happened, but not knowing exactly what. Sensing the gaps in family trees, but never learning how those gaps were created. The manipulation of census data wasn't unique to the Soviet Union. It's a pattern that repeats wherever authoritarian regimes face inconvenient demographic realities. China during the Great Leap Forward experienced a famine that killed tens of millions, and like Stalin's regime, the Chinese government suppressed census data and denied the catastrophe for decades. North Korea has conducted censuses, but keeps the results secret, making it impossible to verify claims about population or living standards. Myanmar has manipulated census data related to the Rohingya population, using demographic statistics as a tool of ethnic cleansing. The lesson is clear: authoritarian governments fear accurate information because it undermines their control. Census data, which should be the most neutral and objective of government statistics, becomes a weapon and a vulnerability. What's remarkable about the Soviet case is how thoroughly the cover-up worked for so long. For 60 years, from the 1930s to the 1990s, the truth about the 1929 and 1937 censuses remained hidden. The regime successfully erased a major bureaucratic undertaking from official history. They murdered the people who knew the truth and terrorized the survivors into silence. They sealed archives that might reveal what happened. They published false data and suppressed real data, and it worked. Yet despite the cover-up's success, truth had a way of persisting. Fragments of census data survived in unexpected places. Memories were passed down in families even when they couldn't be spoken publicly. Researchers noticed inconsistencies and asked questions. The suppressed 1937 census became an open secret among Soviet demographers, something everyone knew about but nobody could officially acknowledge. When the archives finally opened, the truth that emerged wasn't entirely surprising to specialists. It was confirmation of what had been suspected, proof of what had been known indirectly. But for the general public, both in Russia and internationally, the revelations were shocking. The scale of the catastrophe, the deliberateness of the cover-up, the murder of statisticians for telling the truth, all of it reinforced just how brutal Stalin's regime had been. What we still don't know, and likely never will, haunts historians. The central tabulation of the 1929 census, if it was ever completed, remains missing. We don't know exactly how many people were counted before the census was cancelled. We don't know precisely what the preliminary data showed that made it so dangerous. Regional data exists for some areas but not others, creating an incomplete picture. The full documentation of the decision to cancel the census, the Politburo discussions, Stalin's direct involvement, all of this probably existed at one time but has never been found. It may have been destroyed decades ago. It may be buried in archives that remain closed. Or it may be gone forever, lost to the deliberate erasure that the regime practiced so effectively. The death toll from collectivization and the famine will never be known with certainty. Estimates range from 6 million to 10 million or higher. Different researchers using different methods arrive at different numbers. The truth is that when you systematically destroy demographic records, accurate counting becomes impossible. We know millions died. We know the losses were concentrated in specific regions and among specific nationalities. We know it was preventable and was largely caused by deliberate policy, but we'll never know the exact number, and we'll certainly never know all the names. The victims remain partly anonymous, counted in estimates and ranges rather than as individuals. Yet the story of the vanished census teaches us something crucial about power and information. Authoritarian governments don't just fear their enemies, they fear truth itself. Accurate information about their own society becomes a threat because it might reveal the cost of their policies, the failure of their promises, or the lies they've told. Census data should be among the most boring and technical of government statistics, just counting people and recording basic facts. But when a government's legitimacy depends on myths and propaganda, even simple counting becomes dangerous. The Soviet regime killed statisticians not because they were political opponents, but because they counted accurately. That tells you everything about how totalitarianism works. The legacy continues to shape Russia today. The demographic catastrophes of the Stalin era created gaps in population structure that persisted for generations. The missing cohorts, the children who were never born in the early 1930s, would have been parents in the 1950s and grandparents in the 1980s. Their absence rippled forward through time, affecting Russian demographics even now. The trauma of the famine and purges, suppressed for decades, emerged after the Soviet collapse and continues to influence how Russians think about their history. Ukraine's memory of the Holodomor has become central to Ukrainian national identity, particularly in conflict with Russia. The census that vanished was just one episode in a much larger tragedy, but it symbolizes the regime's contempt for truth and human life. The story of the 1929 Soviet census that vanished is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a reminder that governments, especially authoritarian ones, fear their own statistics because numbers don't lie, even when politicians do. When a regime has to murder its own statisticians to hide the truth, when it has to erase entire censuses from history, when it prefers propaganda to data that tells you everything about how it governs and what it's trying to hide. The millions who died in Stalin's famine deserve to be counted, to be remembered, to have their lives and deaths acknowledged. Instead, they were erased, written out of history, along with the census that might have documented their existence. If you found this story fascinating and disturbing, check out our other videos on Soviet history. We've covered the Holodomor in detail, the Great Terror, and other hidden crimes of Stalin's regime. These stories need to be told and remembered. Please like and subscribe to support our work bringing these buried histories to light.